There you go.
Okay,
You're
good.
recording.
Yep. Okay, good. Okay, why don't we get started? People will show up when they show up. I know some people have heard my introduction to the group before, so they don't need to see it all from the very beginning.
Greg,
Sorry, hold on a second.
how would you make it?
Okay. Anyway, welcome everyone. This is the Nashville Microsoft Azure User Group. There's our website link down at the bottom, and the session is being recorded for posting on our YouTube channel. We have a link to the YouTube channel in a subsequent slide. This is our agenda for the evening. It looks a lot bigger than it is. We go through this very quickly. There's a slide on the mission of the group and the history of the group, the meetings that we have, how we run meetings, who's on the board of directors, sponsors and sponsorship opportunities. A page on the YouTube channel so you can see what that's all about, and upcoming events. And once I'm through with that, I'll turn things over to our presenter tonight. So this is the mission of the group. Again, there's a lot of words here, but basically we're all about Microsoft Azure, both infrastructure and development. So, this is kind of the audience that we talk to and the kind of material that we cover. We were actually founded in 2013 with only 4 members, and currently we have over 2,000, which is still amazes me for Nashville's not the biggest city in the country, but we could always use more members. So tell your friends and coworkers about us. Currently, we're only meeting virtually every third Thursday of the month via Zoom, which is tonight. We'll start off with this little introduction and then turn things over to our main presenter. In non-pandemic times, we meet up at Microsoft here in Nashville. And, we have food and networking. Obviously, it's hard to do that when you're meeting virtually. But again, tell us what meeting topics you're interested in too, because we like to schedule topics that folks are interested in. This is our board of directors. I'm the founder and president. Roger Dahlman is co-founder and vice president. Tim, who'll be our presenter tonight, is a member of the board, as is Alkayla Alred. Matthew Puckett is a Microsoft Principal National Cloud Solutions Architect, and he's been our meeting space sponsor when we meet up at Microsoft for the last 8 years. We're fortunate to have Vaco sponsor refreshments for us. And because of the situation with the pandemic, obviously they can't provide refreshments. We've got, they're also a sponsor in another way, which we'll talk about next. So Microsoft currently is paying our meetup dues, which I used to pay for out of my own pocket. So that's great. And Vaco's providing our Zoom subscription. I work for a company called Computer Task Group. We're a consulting firm specializing in Microsoft Azure and also in Amazon Web Services. And we do a lot of migration, a lot of disaster recovery work, as well as a lot of application modernization work. The Greater Nashville Technology Council, which is an umbrella organization here in Nashville, is also a sponsor. And we have a committee, a leadership council that's made up of all the leaders of all the technology groups here in Nashville. And I'm fortunate to be the chairman of that committee. So that's good. And of course, our Ranger 7 Studios, my son, Stephen Michael Zach, is acting as a proctor tonight, controlling the meeting and making sure that no bad actors come in so that he can throw them out if they act up. And he works for, he owns a company called Ranger 7 Studios. That's their logo on the right side there. So he'll be on as well tonight. We're always looking for sponsorships, more sponsorships. So if anyone out there has a company and they want to have 10 or 15 minutes at the beginning of a meeting to promote their company product or services, get in touch with Roger Dahlman. His email address is at the bottom. And there's just some suggestions about how we can arrange for sponsorships. We have raffles. We could raffle things off to the membership, okay? As I said earlier, we have all our meeting content is promoted on our YouTube channel. It's out there. You can see that Tim has presented several times. I've presented a couple of times. We have a lot of other presenters that have presented, and we put the recordings. This recording will show up on the YouTube channel in a day or two, okay? We don't actually have a topic for our November meeting. So again, definitely let us know what you're interested in. We'll try to set it up. And just an upcoming event that you probably all know about, the Microsoft Ignite Global event is coming up in November. So that's a link to that. And by the way, we will, after the meeting, I'll put this deck up or I'll send it out, send it out to the group or put it up somewhere where you can access it. So what I want to do now is turn the floor over to our presenter, Tim Warner. I always want to start when I introduce Tim by saying a man who needs no introduction, but Tim is really well known in the industry. We're very fortunate that he's on our board of directors. And Tim, why don't you take it over? I'm going to make you. You don't have control, so let me change and give make you the host. It's all yours.
All right, Bill, thanks. Let's see here. I'm sharing my desktop. Hold tight for just a moment. Let me get this into full screen. Bill, can you confirm that you can see my slide deck?
Yes, I do.
Great, thank you. Well, hello. Welcome to our monthly at Nashville Microsoft Azure User Group. Hey, that's a nice slogan. I'm going to present for 45 minutes or so, and I'm happy to entertain your questions in the meantime or afterward. This is on the Microsoft Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, or CAF, as it's sometimes called. The way I've structured it is first understand what is this framework and why should you care about it? How could it be helpful to you and your business in Azure? We'll tour the framework in a couple different ways. And because something that's highly theoretical, like the cloud adoption framework, can get, let's face it, kind of tedious and boring, I wanted to introduce some more practical. So we're going to implement the framework using Azure Blueprints. So there'll be something to look at and some new skills, hopefully, for you to pick up with Azure as we work together. Session materials, you can go to timw.info/CAF1. And if memory serves, that link will give you a PDF version of this slide deck. There's also a timw.info/CAF2 link that I will discuss momentarily. That's basically a mind map that breaks out the major pillars of the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework. Sound good? So without further ado, let's understand exactly what this framework is and what its purpose for being is. According to Microsoft, and you can see an attribution URL down on the bottom part of this slide, the Cloud Adoption Framework is a set of best or proven practices, documentation, and tools to help your organization succeed in the cloud. Now that, to me, smacks very much of marketing lingo. Not the big fan of that definition. Let me try to rephrase it using my own language. The idea is this: Microsoft as a cloud vendor understands their customers in terms of, well, we are thinking of going to the cloud. We know we need to go to the cloud, but we see all this stuff about outages in the news. We see all this stuff about breaches. We want to make sure that as we're moving our data and our line of business applications into a public cloud that involves a shared trust between you and Microsoft, that you're not leaving gaps and vulnerabilities open, that you're not making rookie mistakes, these kind of things. So the Cloud Adoption Framework is a framework, a set of ideas and tools, as you can see, proven practices that Microsoft has aggregated to help businesses throughout that planning and migration and maintenance process. I would submit that even if your business has completed your migration and you're in the cloud now, you can use these principles to pick up good tips, tricks, and proven practices. My understanding is that Microsoft actually compiled the CAF by combining their own solution architects, their own full-time architects, Microsoft partner folks, as well as volunteers, and they've just put their heads together in terms of coming up with what works and what doesn't, basically patterns and anti-patterns. Now this guidance, this cloud adoption framework is not Microsoft's exclusive domain. As you can see, here's a link to the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, but the other major cloud vendors like Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud, they have their own cloud adoption frameworks, very similar, because in many ways, it's all the same kind of stuff: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, containers as a service, function as a service. How about we just say X as a service? And so generally the same questions tend to recur. Here's another short link if you're interested. I'll do a brief demo on this momentarily, but this link, timw.info/CAF2, will link to a mind map that I put together that presents the CAF in a more hopefully cohesive way and easier to digest way than just diving headfirst into the docs. In fact, why don't we take a look at that now in our first demo? Let me flip on over to my browser. And here it is. I'm on a Mac, so let me get my sea legs here as far as zooming goes. Hang on just a second. I guess that level of zoom will be okay if it would stop moving. So as you can see here, the Microsoft Azure Cloud Adoption Framework consists of a series of phases, and they are put in an order intentionally. Yikes, this is having a hard time rendering. Let me slowly drag this up. I'm not going to read this to you because you have the link, and we're going to go out and visit the public pages as well. But moving from left to right, you see we start with strategizing. And here I think the biggest takeaway is just formalizing your business's reasons and justifications for wanting to go to Azure. And what you'll find is that the Cloud Adoption Framework has a library of different tools and that kind of stuff. I guess I had magnifier on, that might have been the problem. There we go. Okay, so let me try this again.
Hey, Tim, it was clearer before. It was actually showing full screen on my screen.
Right, I'm gonna, instead of using magnifier, I'm gonna just try to manually zoom. How's that?
Good.
Okay, yeah. So basically, you've got a bunch of Excel sheets and a bunch of question and answer documents that you can download all for free to actually help your business answer these questions in a more rigorous way. You see, financial considerations, that's obviously a pretty important idea. What business outcomes do you hope to realize by migrating to Azure? That kind of stuff. Step 2, planning. This is, again, the theme is actually work through some of these exercises. What is your current inventory on premises? What is it that you're trying to get into Azure? 3, ready. This is where you start to get more into the weeds of, specifically in Azure, how are you going to do whatever migration path you're choosing, whether you're just lifting and shifting on-premises virtual machines directly into Azure, or if you're refactoring applications to run as containers that ultimately will run, say, an Azure Kubernetes service. There we have the concept of the landing zone that we'll take a closer look at momentarily. Then the actual adoption or migration process on step 4. Here you'll see quite a bit of guidance directly in your Azure subscription. If you're familiar with Azure Migrate, where it used to be a couple years ago, the different migration scenarios were kind of all over the place. Azure Migrate is an attempt, and a good one, to consolidate these different environments. Actually, let me flip on over to the portal. Macs are really something else. And we can just briefly duck in there. Because again, I want to try to combine theory and practice as much as I possibly can. And let me zoom in to compensate for my Mac resolution here. And if I do a search in the Azure portal for Azure Migrate, what you're going to see here is a good attempt on Microsoft's part to think about all the stuff that you may want to get into Azure, from raw data to refactored web apps, particularly apps that will run as containers. VDI is virtual desktop infrastructure. The idea there is Microsoft would want you to run your your streaming apps and your streaming Windows 10 desktops in Azure Virtual Desktop or AVD. And then there's several options here for server migration and database migration. So you've got this single interface for doing the actual migration. And really from the highest level, this Azure Migrate scheme is set up first to help you with an assessment to figure out exactly what you're looking at in terms of estimated cost and bandwidth. What VM sizes might Azure recommend based on what your on-premises machines are set up as? Parallel database migrations, which are supported, which are not, all of these sorts of things. And then what's, I think, brilliant about Azure Migrate tools is that in many of these migration goals, you can take the output of your assessment analysis and feed it directly into the migration. And I've spoken to some of the engineers on the Migrate team, so they've told me this directly, that some of their goals for there are minimizing downtime, the idea of replication and failover to do your migration cutover instead of an offline where you've got who knows how much downtime, and also minimizing dependencies, particularly minimizing the requirement to deploy agents on premises to help with that migration process, okay? All right, so back to the framework itself. Once you've done your adoption process, once you've cut over your migration, then it's a question of tightening and tuning and keeping a tight eye on the infrastructure according to several pillars. We'll also take a look in a few minutes of a related framework Microsoft publishes called the well-architected framework. And that is more or less, once you're in Azure, what are the pillars and most important things to keep in mind? Things like obviously security, performance, high availability, monitoring, all of that kind of stuff. So we've got governance and management, security, and then organize. So that is the highest level view of the cloud adoption framework from a really schematic standpoint. I mean, this really isn't done. I have a lot more to do on this particular mind map. Next, let me walk you through those two websites really briefly. If we do a Google search for Azure Cloud Adoption Framework, we can hit the landing page at Microsoft Docs. And I also want to do a search immediately for the Azure Well-Architected Framework, because these are sites that I think are critical. Hopefully you're already aware of them, but if you're not, I think they're super important resources for you to have. And I'll throw in one more for good measure, and that would be the Azure Architecture Center. Okay, so let's pop that into its own tab and let's head on over here. So here's the landing page for the Cloud Adoption Framework. Let me again carefully zoom in a bit more. And just to get you situated here, right across the top, you've got a direct download to get to those work files that I told you about, the tools and templates. Normally, the way the Microsoft Docs libraries work is you're gonna start with an about or just a general introduction. That's what this About the Cloud Adoption Framework is. And actually, let's click into there. And then as you can see on the left-hand side in the docs, it steps through each of those 10 or however many steps or phases there are in the framework. And as you step in each one, it gets pretty dense. I mean, if you haven't gone in here, you'll find out before too long. It's pretty dense and pretty dry. I guess I'd want to say, if you've never attended one of my presentations, you should know that I tend to be pretty opinionated, and that's really for two reasons. One, I'm not a shill. I'm not a sales or marketing person in any way, shape, form, or measure. And number two, if you want marketing fluff, you can go to azure.com. You know, I want to deliver as high impact, valuable benefit to you as I possibly can. Okay, so there you have it. I don't want to say too much more about that. It's just, you know where it is, go to it. The well-architected framework, I think, is a bit more practical, at least in my humble opinion, because we have to remember that the cloud adoption framework is aimed principally at businesses who are either haven't begun their cloud migration journey or who are in the earlier stages of it. The well-architected framework, as you can see, consists of these 5 pillars: reliability, the ability of your system to recover from failures and stay online and functional; security, protecting your apps and data from threats, obviously cost optimization, making sure that you're neither over nor underpaying. That's going to involve a lot of monitoring and alerting. Operational excellence, that's kind of a catch-all or umbrella term to denote, are you following proven practices on just general governance and maintenance of your applications? And then performance efficiency. This makes me think of auto scaling. Is your solution able to adapt to changing loads? That kind of stuff. So that's in a nutshell, well architected. And again, you've got more than one vendor in the game here. As a matter of fact, there's a subset of the cloud adoption framework specifically for multi-cloud scenarios. I mean, this is, I find in my real world experience outside of the classroom, that multi-cloud is definitely becoming much more the rule than the exception. Why is that? Well, hate to say it, but how many outages has Azure experienced itself over the last year or year and change? And some services that are global, like Azure Active Directory, if there's an outage there, then everybody's down around the world. That's not good at all. So multi-cloud makes a lot of sense when you think of a couple points. One, just from a pure high availability standpoint, we want our app and service still running if Azure goes belly up, or if AWS goes belly up, or Google Cloud goes belly up. And number two, all three of these cloud providers are playing basically the same game. Specifically, I think you'll find a huge amount of parity between AWS and Azure. Here I am getting opinionated. I have little doubt that Microsoft did, what's the most politically correct way to say this? They were heavily influenced by AWS when they made the Azure Resource Manager API, because it is very, very similar. And you'll find if you just do a quick Google search, for example, this is in the cloud adoption framework as well. You do a search for something like, okay, we know we're going to need multi-cloud and our team is really good on Azure, but they're not so good on AWS. What if we did a search for AWS for Azure professionals? That's not a really great link. Microsoft has an Azure for AWS professionals, but unfortunately, you're not going to find AWS for Azure professionals. That's kind of a bummer that AWS chooses to do that. By contrast, Google seems to be just as good as Microsoft. If we do Google Cloud for Azure professionals, they've got services there to help you compare the services one-to-one, as well as figure out how can you, coming in with, say, existing Azure or AWS experience, level up on Google. So I would suggest that you rely maybe more on Microsoft if you've got to level up on AWS, because there just ain't nothing there that I've seen on the AWS side, okay? So that's just a little nod towards multi-cloud. Lastly, if I can get over there, there's the Azure Architecture Center. And you can probably very easily get to the well-architected and the cloud adoption framework from here. It's just a question of figuring out the link. But this is a great spot where what I tend to rely on a lot here actually are the reference architectures. There's a library of Azure reference architectures that you can filter based on products and categories. And what you'll find with these reference architectures is that it's able to manifest a lot of these proven practices that you'll read about in both the cloud adoption framework and the Azure well-architected frameworks. I mean, it's one thing I know as a teacher and as a learner to be in the theory, and it's another to be in the real world and see how the theory actually translates. These might be worth your studying. Just do a search. It looks like there's 470 of these as of whatever date it is, October 21st. And what you'll find when you look at these reference architectures is that some of them actually include deployment templates where you can deploy a pilot of one of these. Let's just go to scalable web application. I'm just grabbing that randomly. Yeah, right here. A reference implementation for this architecture is available on GitHub. Isn't that cool? And you can also grab a Visio file of the architecture as well that can help you with diagramming. Again, that I think is in step 2 of the cloud adoption framework, inventorying your existing environment and also mapping out what you want your Azure environment to look like, that concept of the landing zone. So let's proceed in the slide deck a little bit more, touring the framework. What is this showing? I'm just highlighting some of the steps and some of the content that's in the cloud adoption framework that I thought was particularly impactful. You know, I think step one, when you're strategizing and clarifying your business's motivations for migrating to the cloud, this table is pretty cool because it shows on the first column what a business event that might precipitate a business realizing, we better actually start moving on this cloud migration. I mean, if you're going to decommission a data center and you've got an end date in there, well, that's kind of a motivation. And anyway, so that's that. What's this? Here's a screenshot that shows just one of those representative worksheets that I told you that the cloud adoption framework is full of. And you notice that they're Word documents and Excel documents. They're nicely formatted such that you could take these, modify them, and have them be presentation ready very quickly. You see what I mean? And again, it can be a little bit tedious, but it's a heck of a lot better, it seems to me, than just sitting there with a whole lot of nothing thinking, well, the cloud is the hip, slick, and cool thing. We hear about it all the time. Why don't we give it a try? Although I can think of successful businesses that got into the cloud doing exactly that. So go figure. A landing zone is, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, an environment for hosting your workload in Azure. And the key here that I want to drill across is pre-provisioned through code. If you're really going to adopt some of these cloud adoption framework and well-architected framework principles, you're really going to be thinking about DevOps right at the beginning. In other words, having not only your application source code in a shareable way where you can do automated testing, building, and deployment, you know, the concept of the CI/CD pipeline, but you're also hosting or defining the infrastructure that your applications run on as code as well. And this could be nowadays either as JSON templates, the ARM templates as they're called, or potentially you could use the bicep templates as your source code. And then when you do your deployment, Azure Bicep can transpile your .bicep files to .json, and then the deployment proceeds from there. So this is where I want to bridge over into Azure Blueprints a little bit. So the idea is that using this guidance from the CAF and the well-architected, and maybe drawing tools, like throw those in. There's Microsoft Visio. I myself am a huge Lucid Chart fan. I find that it's superior to Visio in just about every way. Microsoft appears to have forgotten about Visio. Again, that's me just dispensing my opinions unasked for. But a tool like Visio or Lucid gives you access to all of those Azure shapes so that you can draw really accurate landing zone diagrams. Now, these can be as simple or as complex as you want to go. I've seen landing zone topologies that involve several subscriptions and even sometimes separate Azure Active Directory tenants. This is just a representative example that I grabbed from the Cloud Adoption Framework website. I'm not even sure offhand what its particular metric is, but I just want to get that idea in your head of having not only topology diagrams of your target environment that are informed and built from these proven practices that you've been learning, but you're provisioning them, not doing the clicky through the portal, but through deployment templates. Why? Well, gosh, just think right off the top. You click yourself to deploy a virtual network with network security groups and Azure Firewall. You did a great job. It looks awesome. Now you need 20 more for customers that you're working with. What are you going to do? Are you going to click all day? And by the time you're at the end of your day, you're kind of looking with your eyes glazing over and you're missing stuff. It's beautiful to deploy this stuff through a template that is going to be the right way every time you run the template. And because you've got your infrastructure code in a central code repository, you're tracking changes. So every change that's made to those deployment templates is tracked and can be rolled back. And if you're incorporating those templates in your build and release processes, then making a change to your infrastructure could be as simple as editing a code file, pushing it to your repository where you may or may not have an approval process before that commit is merged. That merge would typically kick off a build and potentially release process. Automated testing, manual testing, and approvals all check out. Your change goes into production faster than perhaps you ever thought possible. These are some of the promises of DevOps. And forgive me, I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence. You may be far more skilled and experienced with DevOps than I am here. I'm simply trying to be as complete of an instructor as I possibly can. What's this one? Again, this is just showing a representative graphic from the cloud adoption framework. You'll see a lot of flow charts, which I'm a huge fan of to help with decision making. Looks like this is talking about starting point in the upper left with your line of business application workload and thinking of things like data migration and bandwidth analysis, whether the app needs modernization, if it's using legacy protocols, for example, if it's a monolith as opposed to a microservice architecture, these sorts of things. That's a pretty good flow chart, as a matter of fact. And you can see in the lower left corner of the slide, I've got an attribution that'll take you, if that's the correct link, it'll take you to where I got this image. What's this? Governance. This is reminding us of the governance hierarchy in Azure Resource Manager, that you may want to have a single Azure Active Directory instance to have a single identity and access platform, but maybe your business is siloed such that you've got different groups who need to manage their spend independently. So what we can do in Azure Resource Manager is plan for management groups. That's what these top icons are, that are basically containers that you can attach to one or more subscriptions, all within the same Azure AD tenant. And when we apply governance like Azure Policy or role-based access control to those management groups, those changes will flow by inheritance down through the subscriptions, resource groups, and ultimately the resources. So this, again, just has you thinking of proven practice, and we could have another whole brainstorming session on things like developing a cohesive naming strategy for your resources. That's actually a pretty big topic, actually. And as a matter of fact, there's a good docs article on that. Let me see if I do a search for Azure naming conventions and then throw in docs on the end. Yeah, here we go. Develop your naming and tagging strategy, because that's something else, taxonomic tags. Making sure that you're rigorously attaching those name value pairs to your resources. Because, you know, the idea that you're going to keep your cost centers in the resource groups, that's great in theory, but in practice, that breaks down within hours typically, because you're going to wind up with workloads going across resource groups. And then what are you going to do to logically aggregate those resources for cost reporting? Well, that's where taxonomic tags come in. So this is a docs article, and actually this one comes directly out of the Cloud Adoption Framework best practices. Develop your naming and tagging strategy. Boy, this is something that will pay huge dividends if you and your team can get on the same playbook for resource naming, and then you use something like Azure Policy to enforce those naming and tagging standards to ward against human error and forgetfulness and all that kind of stuff. All right, let's see here. Management guide, okay, yeah, you can look at these on your own. These again are just some pretty cool diagrams. There's the multi-cloud aspect of the cloud adoption framework. Fine, fine, fine. What I want to get to is do a practical demo here again to just kind of put some of this into a more real world context. Now, Azure Blueprints, I think, is pretty unique. I can't think of a direct analog to Blueprints in Google Cloud or AWS. I mean, AWS, of course, has deployment templates, the cloud formation, but Blueprints is a pretty interesting offering because what we can do here is define in the template, in the Azure Resource Manager template, not only the infrastructure that we seek to deploy as, say, a landing zone, but we can also attach other artifacts like Azure policy definitions, as well as role-based access control assignments. So that's why Microsoft uses the concept of the blueprint here. You can take all of these proven and best practices, aggregate them together into a reusable versioned artifact. This is the great promise of Azure Blueprints. However, there's some pain points to it. There's no question about that. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me clean up my tabs here in my browser, first of all. And then let's head on over to Blueprints. What are these pain points? Well, the first one is just the fact that Blueprints has been in pre-release or preview status for literally years. I mean, if I had an answer from an NDA perspective, I wouldn't be able to tell you anyway. But from a non-NDA standpoint, I have no clue why this just seems to be sitting here, because it has such great potential. Here's how it works. As you can see on the left side, you've got your Blueprint definitions and then your Blueprint assignments. An assignment in Azure Blueprint terminology is basically a deployment. And this is analogous to Azure Policy, if you've used Azure Policy, where you start with your definitions, you publish them, and then you assign them to actually send them out into your infrastructure. So let's go to Blueprint definitions. And we can see here, I've got some previously created definitions that I've published. And as I said, the Azure Blueprints, when you publish them, you give them a version number. Unfortunately, there's not Git integration. And that's something I mentioned to the team years ago. And they confirmed that support for version control in Azure Blueprints was on their roadmap. But that was like 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know what the heck's going on. So it's really going to be up to you and your team to use Blueprints in a CI/CD DevOps way yourself. But the good news is that I can give you a head start on that momentarily. Now let's go to Create Blueprint. And we can choose to start with an empty blueprint or a sample. And if we take a look at these samples, the one I normally do when I teach this is the simplest one, this basic networking. And that's just going to define a single, simple virtual network with, I think, one subnet and a network security group. But look at here, CAF Foundation and CAF Migration Landing Zone. Wow. So this, again, could be a huge, to use the Microsoft buzzword, a solution accelerator for you and your team. You've already got a template to start with here in Blueprints. The other templates look like they're associated or aligned with industry and governmental compliance schemes. HIPAA for here in the States, healthcare information, and ISO and all that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at the CAF Migration Landing Zone template. We'll build a new template based on that. We'll call this CAF Test Blueprint. And then I didn't like the spaces, I don't think. So let me come back and see if I can put in a hyphen as a delimiter. Yeah, that was okay. And then you can place the blueprint at a scope. This is directly analogous to Azure Policy. And this determines where in that hierarchy the blueprint can be deployed. And you can do management group. Tenant root is the Azure AD tenant itself. I'm going to actually scope this in my sponsorship subscription. And then we proceed to load in artifacts. An artifact can be, let me click Add Artifact here, can be either an ARM template. I don't know about Bicep yet. Again, because Microsoft seems to be sleeping on this blueprint stuff, I don't think it's Bicep aware at this point. So we're just dealing with traditional JSON templates. So we've got ARM templates, RBAC role assignments, or policy assignments as our artifact type. There's actually another one where you can deploy resource groups as well. So let's just take a quick look and see if we can make sense of this cloud adoption framework landing zone. What is it doing? Well, it looks like it's going to deploy 1, 2, 3 resource groups, one for shared services. That's going to be a key vault for secrets and certificates and encryption keys. A log analytics workspace that'll serve as our central monitoring hub. That makes sense. Then we've got another resource group for networks, and we've got an Azure Resource Manager template called a VNet landing zone. And then finally, we have a resource group for Azure Migrate that would evidently serve as our springboard for our Azure Migrate tasks. And that also is an Azure Resource Manager template. Well, let's take a look at this, deploy a VNet landing zone. In the interface here, it shows you the template code. And in the real world, I would copy this out into VS Code, or I would download the blueprint from Azure. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. this interface is definitely not optimal to actually work within it. But you've got your parameters available. And the thing with these parameters I want you to notice is that you can either hard code the parameter value in the blueprint definition, or you can turn on this value should be specified. That makes your blueprint more portable. If you're a cloud solution provider, for example, that would allow you to set your parameters at runtime or at deployment time. And every time you do a deployment, you can just tweak the parameters and away you go. So that's a common pattern you see here. So that's the ARM template. That looks like this one just includes ARM templates, but let's make this a little bit more interesting. For our networks, let's go to add artifact, and we can do something like a role assignment. Let's say that whenever we deploy this blueprint, for that virtual network, we want to make sure that there's at least one discrete role assignment. So for example, there's the built-in network contributor role. We could say, network contributor, this value should be specified, or we can browse our tenant and hard code an Azure AD group or user who would be that. So anytime we assign this blueprint, we can go to sleep at night peacefully, knowing that we've got a network contributor. I'm going to say again, this value should be specified when the blueprint is assigned. Simple as that. Now, the underlying source of all of this stuff is JSON, as you'll see in just a minute. Even those RBAC definitions, and also the last type of artifact. Let's do that again in the resource group for networks. We'll go to add artifact, and this time I'll choose policy assignments. Now, in a nutshell, if you're not familiar with Azure policy, these are JSON files that allow you to put guardrails on just about any conceivable aspect of your Azure environment, from making sure that you have diagnostic logging configured, to preventing deployments to unauthorized regions, to making sure that only approved VM sizes are deployed. Just about anything you can think of, you can encapsulate in one of these policy JSONs. And a neat thing that you've got here in Azure is the concept of the initiative definition. And an initiative is basically a container into which you populate multiple policies. So it provides an easier way to deploy several policies at once rather than have to manage a whole bunch of assignments separately. I have one here called AZ500 that's a custom initiative, and I don't think, maybe it'll show us what it is. Let's see, if we select the policy assignment, no, it looks like it doesn't show us in the GUI, but it's a collection of like 3 or 4 policies that do different things. Anyway, you save your work here in the portal as a draft, and then presumably you and your colleagues can work on it to your heart's content. You're not going to be able to actually assign any of these blueprints unless you've published at least one version. So what we can do if we're ready is we can select our CAF test blueprint that's currently in draft mode, and we can publish it. And you have to provide a version number. And I'm going to hit publish. And now this blueprint is ready for assignment if we're ready. And another thing we can do is we can download the source code of these blueprints to put them into our source code control. Like I said, unfortunately at this point, if you want to use automation and CI/CD processes with Azure Blueprints, you're going to have to grab the source. If you've created them in the cloud, that is, you're going to have to grab the source. I use Azure PowerShell. So let me show you. I've got VS Code up here. And the first thing you'll want to do is make sure to install the AZ Blueprint module. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. Yeah. So assuming you've got PowerShell core installed on your machine, you can do an install module az.blueprint, and that'll give you the official Azure Blueprint commands. And then here on line 5, I'm creating a variable that stores one of my published blueprints. This one is grabbing the basic ACR AKS one, and you specify which version you want. Let me actually right click and run that selection. Get rid of this debug console. And then in order to download the blueprint from Azure, I can do an export AZ blueprint with artifact, just passing in that object, that blueprint object that I created previously. And I'm going to actually put it on my desktop. So let me change my directory to the desktop here, and let me run this code right here. And you can on your own look at the different commands that are in that AZ Blueprint module. It gives you pretty good control over Blueprint lifecycle. You can create new empty Blueprint scaffolds. You can assign, you can create published versions of blueprints programmatically, and then you can even do an assignment programmatically. So you don't have to be in the portal if you don't want to. I've never done any of this with Azure command line interface, so I'm not 100% sure that it's supported. I tend to use PowerShell as a matter of habit or practice. Now let me do a file open folder here in VS Code. What's going on with my dialog box here? Oh my word. Yeah, well, let me open up that basic AKS folder. And just to show you what the source of a blueprint definition looks like, it's pretty ugly, unfortunately. So you've got a folder that is your blueprint definition, and you've got a manifest file that it has to be called blueprint.json with an uppercase B. And that's just basically a run of all the parameters and names of everything that's in the blueprint definition. And then if we go in artifacts, again, this is pretty ugly because I've just downloaded this from the portal. If you start from your local machine, you'll have an opportunity to name your artifacts files a little bit better. This is way ugly, but these represent all of those discrete artifacts, and it's all in JavaScript object notation or JSON. So that's what the source code looks like. Now to wrap up here with an assignment, if we wanted to assign this CAF test blueprint, we can select a published version. I'm on version 1, and assign it. Now assign in our context means deploy. So what we're actually instructing Azure Resource Manager to do is to run a deployment using these artifacts. So that's what assign means in this context here. My home region is East US. And the idea is over time, as your blueprint definitions are evolving, you can periodically publish new versions, or you might have a single baseline 1.0, and then for different contexts, you might do 2, 3, 4, and then depending on the context of assignment, you would know which version you want to actually assign. Now, something I think that's pretty interesting with these blueprints is the concept of the lock assignment. You know how in Azure Resource Manager RBAC that permissions are only additive? You can't do anything subtractive. If somebody has a contribute at the subscription scope and there's a resource group that they should only have read to, you're kind of stuck unless you take some remediative action. You're not going to be able to override that parent permission. The lock assignment does. It's pretty darn cool. You could say, I want to make this deployment read only, where no changes are allowed outside of the blueprint, or a kinder, gentler way is to just put a do not delete, which is what I'm going to do. Now, the security context for the deployment happens with a managed identity. I'm going to let Azure create a system assigned identity here. And then you've got your parameters. Now, depending upon what you've set up in your blueprint definition, you may have to put something in here, or if there's a default set, you can just use the default. I'm going to override the default on a couple of these. For the deploy key group, it's asking for an Azure AD group or an object ID to grant. Oh, this is getting ugly. I don't think this is going to work really well. Let me bail out. Sorry about that. It's asking for too much. Let me go back to a simpler one, a VNet that I have here, and let's just assign this guy here. So we'll do again, East US is my region. I've got just the one version. I'm going to do a do not delete lock with a system assigned managed identity. And here I don't have to provide anything, I don't think. Yeah, it looks like I've actually hard coded the values here, so I don't even have an opportunity to override. So let's make that assignment. And again, it says creating the assignment. That's a little misleading. Azure is actually doing this deployment. So if we take a look at our resource group list, we should see a test RG show up before too long. And then in that test RG, we'll see the additional artifacts that are specified in that template definition. least I'm hoping so. Did something go wrong here? Let's just quickly debug. Let's go back to blueprints. Let's go back to blueprint definitions. Let's go to VNet blueprint and let's edit the blueprint. And let's do something a little bit different here. Let's go to look at our artifacts and let me just override so this will run a bit more smoothly. So in this blueprint, this is defining a network security group and a virtual network. And as far as parameters, I'm going to actually say this value should be specified when the blueprint is defined. That way I'm not sure what happened when I did the assignment a moment ago. Just want to try to smooth things out as much as I can. Let's save a draft here. And then let's publish this as a new version. And then we'll do an assignment. I know I'm clicking a little bit fast. I apologize for that. So in this case, I want to make sure to choose 2 as my version. And still, must have test RG hard-coded in there. Darn it. Well, I guess failing anything else, I could always just quickly create that resource group. I'm just kind of doing a little live without a net stuff with you right now. Pardon the dust. Because I'm not sure the blueprint assignment will create the resource group. It probably will. I'm probably running myself in circles for no reason. Yep, sure enough, I was. So anyway, forget what I was doing a moment ago. That didn't exist. Instead, let's take a look at our resource group. And here we've got our test RG. And this is what the blueprint did. It created the network and it created the NSG. Now watch this. This is really cool. If I go to access control IAM, you're probably familiar with role assignments. That's fine. That allows people and processes to do stuff. Deny assignments. When you do a lock in Azure Blueprints, this is the only context in Azure that I'm aware of that uses deny assignments. And this is going to block users from performing actions. In fact, look at this weird identity, all principals, which I think is the Azure equivalent to the everyone special identity in Windows Server. And so this is saying that I don't care if you're an owner, you're not going to be able to make a delete. Remember, I said a do not delete lock on this resource group. So what you're forced to do for all intents and purposes is if we need to delete something, we're going to have to go to the blueprint, delete it from there, and then reassign that blueprint. You see what I'm saying? So it's a paradigm shift. This morning I was presenting on Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, last night too, as a matter of fact. And there the paradigm shift is instead of doing your role-based access control directly in Azure and your resource groups and subscriptions or in Azure AD, you're doing your authorization work within the PIM console. Here, from an infrastructure as code standpoint, it's a similar idea. The idea is instead of horsing around here, you should be going to your definition, making modifications there, then reassigning that new version that you have. That's the point. So to wrap this up, I can come over back to overview and I can just head on over to this NSG and I can attempt to delete it. And even though I am in fact an owner, Azure should not allow me to do that. I don't know why the notifications aren't showing up. This is really strange. Cannot delete network security group. Oh, well, when they're in use. Okay, well, that's something else. It's in use. It looks like this NSG is associated with a blueprint. Well, let's see if we can disassociate that. Would that be considered a delete operation? We'll find out in just a moment. It did allow us to disassociate it, but it shouldn't allow us certainly to do a delete. I think I've released it. There's no network interfaces. There's no subnets anymore. Yeah, I'm not sure why I'm getting that particular, but it's the blueprint that's offering the protection. I hope that makes some semblance of sense. Now, lastly, I mentioned that I was going to give you a head start on using the blueprints in terms of infrastructure as code, cloud adoption framework, proven practices. And what you can look at there is, let me jump ahead. Are you using Azure DevOps or are you using GitHub? Now, of course, I know that there's other platforms out there. These are the two Microsoft options. The lay of the land with Azure blueprints in these products is as follows. It really comes down to a community member named Neil Peterson. I don't know if Neil is a Microsoft employee. He's a nice guy. I've communicated with him via email a little bit. But he's created an Azure DevOps extension called Azure Blueprints that gives you the YAML. There's not a classic. If you're familiar with Azure pipelines, you've got the graphical classic builder, and then you've got the YAML markup version. Neil's extension here works only with the YAML pipeline, but this allows you to work with blueprints, to publish versions and to do assignments in your build and release processes in Azure DevOps. So in Azure DevOps, you can go to the marketplace, install the Azure Blueprints extension, and then it will be available in your Azure Pipelines experience. So that's one way to go about automating your infrastructure as code in a reliable way, integrating with Azure Blueprints. If you're using GitHub, Neil also created a GitHub Actions task, as you can see here. If you do a search in the GitHub tasks library for Azure Blueprints, you'll find it. And if you've used GitHub Actions, there's no graphical interface. It's all YAML. I have a simple example. I didn't have a chance to finish it before presentation, but I have a sample repository under my account, github.com, Timothy Warner. I think it's AZ Blueprint. Yeah, and what I have here is a sample blueprint definition. In fact, it's not complete. Like I said, I wasn't able to finish it before the session today. But if you want to automate the build and assignment of Azure Blueprint code, if you're using GitHub, you can store the blueprint definitions in your repo as usual. And then under settings, you'll want to create some secrets. If you're using Neil Peterson's Azure Blueprints action, you're going to need to create a secret for your Azure application ID and application secret. Excuse me. This is going to be the security context. The security context that Azure or that GitHub will use when it runs the code and does the work for you in Azure. And you'll also need a secret variable that stores your Azure Active Directory tenant ID. But once you have that, then it's a case of just working on the action file. And if you've used GitHub Actions, you've got the hidden folder .github with a subfolder called workflows. And then you've got your workflow file specifically in YAML, yet another markup language format. And finally, if you hit edit this file, it brings you into the GitHub editor where you have access to the marketplace. And like I said, if you do a search for Azure Blueprints, you can get to Neil's work over here. And then the actual code, no need to go into the weeds here. But it's the same basic process that you would have in any build environment, where depending upon what action, in this case, I've got it set that if I do a push and commit to my main branch, that'll have this code file run automatically. And what it will do is first connect to a build server, a cloud-based build server. And then I was in the process of starting a blueprint assignment using Neil's code here. If you come over here and click the blueprint task, it'll give you a snippet of code that you can just copy and paste in. And Neil did a pretty good job of documenting with comments what each element in that YAML is. So anyway, the purpose of this Azure Blueprints detour was to get us doing some real work in addition to looking at the theory, and also just to try to make the cloud adoption framework theory more manifest, how it might ultimately work in a process, in a real world context. That's the idea with that. So in summary, I submit that there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You know how inefficient parallel processes are. You've burned through, you and your team have burned through all of these hurdles, and then you realize another work team at your org has already been there, done that, and bought the t-shirt last year. And you think, oh my God, if I had known this, we could have picked your brain and saved so much heartache. You've got these tools and these tool sets in Azure, namely the Cloud Adoption Framework, the Well-Architected Framework, and the Azure Architecture Center. If you're multi-cloud, you've got Cloud Adoption Framework and Architecture Centers in AWS and Google Cloud as well. All right, so again, session materials are timw.info/CAF. That mind map, the URL for that, if I remember, is actually timw.info/CAF2. I don't know where CAFMM will lead you. Go there if you dare. Twitter, I'm at Tech Trainer Tim, and my website is techtrainertim.com. Well, I'm happy to entertain any questions, comments, experiences that you have at this time. Bill, anything going on in the queue?
Stephen's actually managing the queue. Stephen, do we have folks who want to ask questions?
Right now, not seeing anything. Let me go to the chat again here.
Okay, give a couple minutes more.
Nope, doesn't look like anybody. We just have one direct message, but I took care of that.
Okay. Okay, folks, this is your chance to ask questions if you have questions. By the way, I really appreciate your candidness when it comes to blueprints, Tim. I've had a love-hate relationship with blueprints for quite a while.
Yeah.
So it's not finished, in my opinion.
No.
I'm not under NDA, so I can say that. But it's just not well integrated and finished, which is why it's probably been, in.
Okay, we have a question. Someone would like to know, can you talk a bit about policy?
Yeah, sure. Let me go back to the portal. And actually, let me do a search here for policy. The Cliff's Notes to Azure Policy, as I mentioned, is you've got this bucket load of definitions. Now, Microsoft keeps all of these default policy definitions and more out on GitHub. If you go to github.com/Azure/policy, you can get all of these built-in ones and a whole lot more. So there's a lot that you can start from. But the idea here is that you can work with these individual policy files. That means instead of looking at initiatives, we can filter the view here just to look at specific policies. Actually, scratch that. Let me filter the view to show my custom initiative that I referenced earlier, just as a representative example. So we can do things like add a specific tag to resources. We can make sure that if somebody tries to deploy in our subscription outside of the East US, that deployment will fail. From a monitoring standpoint, we might want to make sure that all virtual machines deployed to Azure have the log analytics extension installed immediately. So basically, it's a question of thinking about your governance and how your desired state of your Azure environment should look, and then hunting down the policies that will enforce that. And Azure Policy has a number of different effects that you can choose from. If we look, for example, at this allowed location JSON, and if we come down here, the policies all work on the basis of an if statement, an if evaluation. That's the policy rule. And this one says basically, if the location field of a deployment is not in what you've specified as the list of allowed locations, that's a parameter, then the effect is deny. So you can do a light touch with Azure Policy and just have it audit non-compliant resources. You can have it deny deployments, or believe it or not, you can have Azure Policy remediate or fix problems. That can be particularly helpful if you realize later in the game, we need to use taxonomic tags. And meanwhile, we've got hundreds or thousands of resources already extant out there that are not tagged. You can fix that. If we look at this add the class tag to resources policy, this one, the policy evaluation is saying, if the tag name field is empty, then the effect is modify, actually do the work and go ahead and add the tag name and value that you've provided as parameters. So policy is super duper powerful from a governance standpoint. But as I mentioned, the workflow in Azure Policy is similar to what we did with Blueprints in terms of you've got your definitions, your individual policies, maybe initiatives that roll up several policies. And then you go through an assignment process where you unleash the policy, and then you can follow compliance here or in log analytics or wherever. And if you have policy that's capable of remediation tasks, you can follow up on that progress here as well. Hopefully that helped you out a bit.
Okay, the next question is, they say, great, thanks. The next question is, do they need to redeploy the blueprint to remove the locks?
Yes. Yeah, if we, for instance, realized that that do not delete lock was a bad idea, we're going to need to fix that at the blueprint level. Because yeah, those locks are going to affect owners and everybody. So we can go back to the active assignment that we have here. If we go to assigned blueprints, we can see our assignment. Now, one thing you could do is unassign the blueprint. And that, I visualize it as like, you know, a terrarium that has a cover. Who remembers Biosphere? I'm kind of older. And when you remove or unassign a blueprint, you're taking that bubble of protection off of the infrastructure. That would be one thing to do. But what we want to do, if we want to fix that locking issue, is update the assignment. And we can say, don't lock. And then we can check our other metadata here. Maybe we want to do a different version. And then we reassign. So that's the answer to your question. You can either temporarily unassign the entire blueprint, or you can update the assignment.
Okay, and next question is, when it comes to the GDPR, can we literally pull out off the portal and apply to a specific subscription or a resource group?
Might you have been talking about a template that covers GDPR stuff? I wonder if.
I think they are. Can they, in other words, can they pull it out of the portal and apply it to a specific subscription or a resource group?
Okay, yeah. Now, if I understand your question, I hope I'm getting at least some of it, but here goes. It seems to me that you could do a blueprint that addresses GDPR remediation, and then when you assign it to a resource group that has stuff already in it, the way Azure Resource Manager works by default is doing an update operation. It's called, there's two deployment modes. There's complete, and what's the default one is called incremental. Yeah. So incremental says, if there's a change in what you want to deploy vis-a-vis what's in that resource group, do the update. But if your blueprint is not going to affect or reference other stuff that's in the resource group, then leave that alone. But the other way to do a deployment is complete. And that says, if there's anything in that resource group not indicated in your blueprint or in your deployment template, delete it, or at least try to delete it. So I would just encourage you to think of creating a blueprint environment, deploying it to an existing resource group, and Azure always does default to the incremental mode, but you might want to double check and see if you're going to do it programmatically, like in PowerShell, if you can explicitly state, make sure it's incremental.
Okay, does a blueprint negate a policy effect if both are applied separately to the same MGT group or a subscription?
The rules for policy, effective policy, are a bit more complex. If we do a quick Google search for Azure policy inheritance, there's a good docs article that discusses how you can determine effective policy. But the bottom line is, it's a bit on the complicated side. I don't have a quick, easy answer to that question. So I would recommend, and actually I'm going to make sure after we end this, I'm going to research this tonight. And if you follow my Twitter handle, Tech Trainer Tim, I'll report back if I get some good, some information back. But yeah, there is a rubric, there is a logic to how Azure resolves conflicting policy. If you've got one policy saying one thing that's already in the resource group and another one that's coming in from the blueprint, yeah, it's not just an additive thing, obviously. So I know that wasn't a complete answer, but that's the best I have for you at this point.
Okay, next question. I am currently building out an Azure environment for a POC. It has resource groups, storage, VNets, VMs, virtual gateways, etc. Where in Azure can I go to export the config of each resource in PowerShell so I can build an ARM template for future deployments of the same environment?
Right. Okay, well, you mentioned PowerShell. What I was initially thinking of is directly in the portal. If you take a look at your resource group, because the resource group is really the fundamental unit of deployment, you can take a look at the deployment record of your resource group. If we go into deployments, and this is going to show every deployment that was made. And then if you drill into a deployment, you can get to the underlying JSON. Now, the hazard here is that unless this is code that you and your team wrote yourselves originally, in which case you probably don't care about exporting it, the code that the portal generates is pretty ugly, honestly. It's not very optimized at all. So I'm not sure I'd even recommend that as a great idea. But this is how you can quickly, at least in the Azure portal, get to the source code of your deployment. And then if you hit download, as you can see here, it comes down as a zip archive, and you'll get a template.json that you can open in, VS Code or whatever it is that you want to use. As far as PowerShell, I'm just about positive that you can export these deployments using PowerShell. I haven't actually done that. Just for grins, let me quickly do a search here. Azure PowerShell export JSON from resource group. Export AZ resource group. Oh, cool. But it looks like that's just going to grab the resource group as a single JSON file. Export template. So it looks like here there is some guidance in the Microsoft Docs to help you with that. This one I'm looking at right here is saying use Azure PowerShell to export a template. It looks like it's also supported with the Azure CLI as well. But again, I want to repeat the caveat there is if you're going to be exporting JSON that was dynamically created by Azure, it tends to be pretty ugly because there's no logic in terms of parameters. It just, ARM will create, if you've got 30 options in your JSON, you'll have 30 parameters. So you can count on, once you get the JSON, you're going to need to be doing quite a bit of horsing around removing junk. So it might be worth your while to just code the template from scratch yourself, honestly.
Can we create a blueprint to define complex naming convention rules with different rules to different services?
Right?
That's the question.
Oh, how would you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to answer that question really comes down to having a good grasp of ARM template JSON code. Because what you'll find is, that the main artifact in Azure Blueprints is an ARM template. And the ARM template defines your resources, and that's going to be where you embed your naming convention. So what we can do, for example, is go to ARM template reference, or even better, we can do ARM template built-in functions. There's a number of functions called ARM template functions that you can bring to bear. For example, there's a common one that you see called concat that allows you to string together multiple elements. And so you can use techniques like this if you have a naming convention, for instance, where as a parameter, you can provide a prefix. And then even at that, you can constrain. In ARM JSON, there's what's called an allowed values array, where you constrain, maybe you can only choose from certain prefixes. So you can include that in your parameter definition. And then when it comes time to actually deploy the resource, you can do something like a concat that takes that parameter value and then sticks it on front of another element. So what you're doing is dynamically building and therefore enforcing your naming convention in the JSON code. The good news about Azure Policy is that Azure Policy respects and supports all of these ARM template functions. So you can use Azure Policy to make sure that your resources are following those naming conventions.
And let me comment, Jim, that naming conventions are one of the most important things to worry about. That, you know, Microsoft suggestions are good, and you've got to have a consistent set of naming conventions. There's some good that's good documentation that talks about how to create a naming convention. There's few different variations, but I find it extremely helpful. I always say I'm a veteran of the naming convention wars.
Yeah, seriously, it will pay huge dividends getting on board. I mean, it can be painful to retroactively implement a naming convention, but it's certainly better than nothing.
Yeah.
I did give you all that link in the docs earlier in this presentation, but just do a Google search for Azure naming convention docs. And if you're using a good ad blocker, like I use uBlock Origin, for example, get rid of all the sponsored garbage. You'll have as your first search result the docs article that talks about that.
Hey, are there any more questions?
Okay, well, Tim, thanks a lot. It was a great presentation as always. And
Welcome.
for everyone else, that we'll see you next month. And as soon as we get the recording downloaded, we'll load it up into Teams and send out a notice. Thanks again, Tim.
Thanks, everybody.